What is going on, y'all? I'm KM Best. Let's take a look at the best decks in Marvel Snap, both for ladder and to get you that Conquest Infinite win. First up is the newest iteration of the Lockjaw High Evolutionary deck. This time, the tech slot is including Wave instead of Killmonger as a hedge against the increase in bounce decks that we have seen recently. This is still what I would consider the default 12, but there's a lot of different ways to play around with it. So let's go on a journey as I show you the various cards that can go in the tech slot for this list. Replacing Wave with Killmonger makes us significantly better against the decks that rely on a lot of one-cost cards. So, for example, the best thing that Killmonger does most of the time is kill Nebula and Sunspot out of decks like High Evolutionary Lockdown and perhaps Electro Ramp. So, if you're facing a lot of those decks, Killmonger might be a better choice than Wave. I'm going to call this one highly speculative. This is a Dr. Octopus in here, pioneered by Den CCG. Shout out to Den. I used to actually edit some of his work. Huge fan. So Den was playing this in the Creator Clash UK. The idea is that Dr. Octopus is very good against bounce, and it also seems to be pretty good against some other decks that are reliant on playing cards in a specific order. If you wanted to try out something spicy, you can try this one out. I think it's an interesting way to take the deck. I do think the Wave list is still just the default one. Good matchups into a lot of stuff, depending on how you snap and retreat. Nothing feels super unwinnable. You have a lot of fair matches, which is weird to say about a Lockjaw deck, but you do, right? Like, you generally get to do your stuff because you run America Chavez, you have Lockjaw, you have Thor, you have stuff you do in the early game, and then you have stuff you do in the late game. Generally speaking, you play a fair game sometimes, and you play a very unfair game sometimes, and that's a good spot to be in. It's the default deck. I think this is a deck you should be prepared for in every scenario when you play an Infinite Conquest, when you queue any ladder game. You should be prepared for this. You should also be prepared for this. Bounce has risen up out of the ashes of everyone thinking that you lost to Wave and has become one of the top decks in the game, one of the most powerful decks in the game. The list you see here, I believe, was made by Lambie Series and Browday. I think it's a pretty solid one. The basic idea is we have to choose between either one of Shang-Chi or Iron Man. They chose Iron Man to challenge those high Evo lanes, and because it's a little bit of a better play after a wave if you really have to, or before a wave if you get the chance, and in addition, extra synergy with Bast. Another card I really wanted to highlight here is Jeff, who does just a ton of work in this list, because this list otherwise is very bad at getting into closed off locations, and people genuinely do not expect El Jefe to come out of nowhere and screw them over. Another thing that Jeff does really, really well is you can play Jeff through Sandman if he's the second card you play. So keep that in mind if it ever comes up. Sandman players will not expect a bounce deck to be able to play two cards after a Sandman, basically ever. It's pretty rare for this to seriously matter, but if you play like Jeff and a Kitty, it can matter because, you know, let's say you play the Jeff on a Nebula lane, preventing the Nebula from growing. You get your 3 extra points there. That's actually a 5-point swing. That's the kind of situation that can really matter in a matchup against Sandman, especially if they're not expecting it. You can get a lot of cubes out of that. Here's what my current build of High Evolutionary Lockdown looks like, and I think the goal of this deck is basically we're going to beat bounce about as bad as we can. We're going to have good matchups into pretty much everything else, and we're going to have what is likely an unfavorable matchup into the High Evolutionary Lockjaw decks, but as they seem to be cutting Killmongers, it's not as unfavorable as it used to be, because the Killmonger obviously is an absolutely incredible card against this deck. We are very reliant on our 3-1 cost cards. It is an extremely, extremely big blow to see a Killmonger come down and blow up a Misty Knight, a Sunspot, and a Nebula, and there are games where you are playing all 3. Those are going to be the first 3 turns of the game for you. You do not win those games when those get Killmongered, so you do have to keep an eye out for Killmonger and how that card ends up playing. You're actually more afraid of Killmonger than you are of Luke Cage when you play this deck, which is kind of crazy for an Evo deck. In addition, you're going to want to keep an eye on the fact that we have a lot of just base level good ways to win a game. You are still a lockdown deck. You still have Storm. You still have Spider-Man. You still have Doctor Doom. It's still a good thing to be doing. Your weakness to Killmonger is just something you're going to have to live with if you choose this list. You can try to replace Daredevil with armor. I personally think that the Daredevil is pretty important for getting a sense of where your opponents are going. There are a lot of big, swingy 5-cost cards that are played on turn 5, and knowing what's happening is usually pretty valuable. So I really do like the Daredevil. If you find yourself not caring about the Daredevil, armor is a great replacement. Here is my current build of Electro Ramp, and this is a build that Moyen took to the Creator Clash UK, and I think it's generally an upgrade on the original deck, but it's so hard-teched for the meta that you kind of randomly lose to some other stuff some of the time. So the fact that we're running, like, for example, we have the Iceman in here to target mirrors and Lockjaw. We have no America Chavez because we wanted to fit the Iceman in here. We have the Wong in here because we want to go bigger than mirrors. We want to go bigger than Lockjaw. So we go Wong into Black Panther, into Arnim Zola. But that's actually pretty weak against decks that are actually playing ways to interact with it. Right now, there aren't a lot of decks that are in, like, tier 1 that are playing a lot of ways to interact with this. I would think that this deck is favored against the 3 decks I just talked about. But here's the thing. If you run into somebody who's playing like Shang-Chi and Cosmo, you're probably dead. If you run into somebody who's playing ways to put asymmetrical power on the board in face of your leader, like a Devil Dinosaur, you're probably dead. And so this is a weird deck where it's extremely powerful against an expected metagame. And then if you run into like some decks that you don't expect or aren't prepared for, you can just lose immediately. You can just absolutely get rolled by whatever, as long as they are able to make leader asymmetric and or interact with your Arnim Zola, Wong, Panther stuff. Because that is what this deck is built to do. And if they can interact with that profitably, they will get your ass. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Darkhawk archetype, because right now I think there are 2 major ways to build it. I do think that you kind of want to include Killmonger in this list as a little bit of a hedge to the lockdown decks, although it is pretty bad in a lot of other matchups. Killmonger, it's not going to be the greatest thing you can do, but this deck has legitimate game into the lockdown decks between Killmonger killing off your opponent's 1-cost cards, which as discussed are very valuable, Jeff and Silk moving into other locations. You end up having some real game against that matchup, and that matchup was very hard for you to beat. However, one thing you do lose out on here is that by playing Black Bolt and Stature, you end up losing out on being able to play Wave. And that means that when you match up into a bounce deck, you are just going to lose on points. They are going to have more points than you, and you are going to be in a ton of trouble unless you are able to fully throw priority, Killmonger them on the final turn of the game. It's very hard to actually pull this off. So bounce is something that this archetype really struggles with. If you have ideas for making it better, maybe we play like Invisible Woman Killmonger. I don't even think that's crazy at this point. Like, right now, I think that anything that gets us points against bounce would be very, very valuable. I honestly would try Invisible Woman Killmonger. It's just there's so many awkward things going on that we want to be able to cover all these situations, and it's very hard to cover all of them. Revisiting Darkhawk for a second, this list attempts to solve the problems with bounce by including Wave, but it ends up getting a lot clunkier because we have Wave, we have multiple 6-drops, we have America Chavez, we have an Iron Lad that is hopefully hitting those multiple 6-drops. It gets a lot clunkier when you don't draw Zabu, basically. Because if you're not drawing Zabu, your turn 3 is just awful, which is part of why I like having America Chavez in this list, because she makes you more likely to draw Zabu. If you aren't drawing Zabu, your turn 3 is oftentimes going to be something like Wave into Doctor Doom. Like, that is gonna happen a decent amount of time because you are just not doing anything otherwise. Like, you have like a 1/1 cost, 2/2 costs, and then 3 costs that you don't really want to play. And it's a lot clunkier than it needs to be. This is what it looks like, though, when Darkhawk decks try to answer every problem available, right? Like, if you're just like, I want an answer to every single thing in my deck, I don't care how thin it stretches me, this is doing that. I've been enjoying Iron Lad Patriot a little bit recently, although I do think the fact that it just doesn't go tall enough is a factor in a lot of matchups. It's a good deck that gets to run Wave. that gets to run Luke Cage. It gets to have decent matchups into a lot of stuff, and it doesn't super hard lose to anything because Invisible Woman can protect your Patriots from things like Enchantress, which isn't really that common anyway. Mostly what this deck loses to is not really doing anything or not really doing enough things. Like, if you aren't doing the strong stuff in this deck, you are extremely mopey. And there are certain matchups where you don't really feel confident snapping on the strong stuff because, well, it's not a great matchup, and then you're just in hell, right? Like, that's the issue that this deck has, is like sometimes even when it does the stuff, it's not good enough. And that's a tough spot to be in. You have to like really know the matchups where your cards are good enough, where you have to introduce variants. And I've enjoyed playing this deck a lot. It's been weirdly good for me. But I don't know if I would say it's one of the genuinely recommended decks. I think it's pretty good, but I think it's probably a cut below some of the other things we've talked about today. Finally, I've got a little bit of an honorable mention here. This is a deck played by JungCat that won the most recent Snap Fan Open. I have no idea what to make of it. I'll be honest with you. I think this is probably an incredibly talented player played this, and you have to have your brain on entirely. But I know people are going to be looking for Ghost Spider decks to do the quest with. I would encourage trying this one. One thing that I was kind of confused on is like, why do we need Stegron if we could play Juggernaut instead? And I think a lot of the answer seems to be Stegron is always turning Miles on, whereas Juggernaut is not always turning Miles on, despite Miles being probably a better card. One interesting thing here is there's no wave in here, so against bounce, it seems as though our plan is genuinely just we get our dagger big enough to win. We are going points for points against the bounce decks, and that seems to be what we're trying to do. And that is a little bit valuable because dagger is always going to be hitting for stuff against for procs against the bounce decks. Like you are going to be able to go point for point there if you can. It's just I don't know if that's enough necessarily for make me feel confident in it. But the mix-up we have between Heimdall and Magneto, the fact that we can actually just play Heimdall against bounce decks, hard target 2 lanes, and just try to go as tall as possible, I think that is pretty valuable, but it also requires just an immense amount of planning. So this is a deck that I would not try unless you have the world's biggest brain and you're willing to commit some real time into learning how it plays out. Because a lot of the things I struggle with this list, it's future planning, right? Planning, okay, if I Heimdall, I'm going to do this, this, and this. Okay, I should have snapped 3 turns ago. Like, there's a lot of those moments when you play a deck like this, and when you play any move deck, really. So I would encourage you, like, I would investigate this. If you want to get your Ghost Spider wins in, go nuts. But this is, like, clearly doing something powerful, and I think also clearly doing something unexpected. And there's a lot of value in something being unexpected. So I did want to highlight it here, because I know people want those Ghost Spider wins for the weekend quests, and because, I mean, it won a tournament. There might be legitimately something here. So do keep your eyes on this archetype. I hope it ends up really good, because as everyone knows, I am the #1 Ghost Spider stan. Shout out to Gwen Stacy. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed this edition of the KN Best Top Decks. These are the decks I would play both in Conquest and on Ladder, and I think it's in like a rough order. Nothing like super specific. Is there anything you think that I missed? Anything you want me to cover next time? Please let me know in the comments. I really appreciate it. I read every single one of them because my brain cells have rotted into nothingness. As always, I've been KN Best. I will see you next time. Peace.